Okay. First of all, thank you so much. It's been honestly, truly, sincerely exciting being in conversation with everyone here. Thank you to Drugo More, to the folks the organizers, to Davor and Valeria, to Mara, everyone that I've had the opportunity to spend some time with. As I conveyed to some of you, actually some of this work I find doing it in the States a bit marginalizing, so it's been amazing finding so many people thinking and talking about the same thing over here in Croatia. So thank you. The publication is fantastic, the exhibition was fun, and also thanks to all the other partners, of course, who helped fund. What the presentation I'm giving, I did write out in advance. I thought I would be most articulate that way. I'm basically looking to try to put forth a suggestion, an informed suggestion, if you will, about why or how the criminalization of all the figuring outs that we've grappled with over the last couple of days, how the criminalization of them came about through what a set of theorists that I'm looking at, 4 theorists, conceptualize as something like an internal colonization. So the first 60% of this paper, talk, lecture, whatever you want to call it, will be on those 4 theorists. And then the last 40% kind of narrates some historical writings about figuring out illegalisms, however you want to put it. I will say, preparing this paper was difficult. I don't have time to situate the theorists very well, of course, and really most difficult was thinking about this kind of work can be pretty, here's an American phrase, hairy, and it's hard to know what are the aspects that certain audiences will see problematic or not. So I ask that you allow me some grace and bear with me as we figure that out together. And that said, I'll start. Okay. In August of 1969, one of the co-founders of the Black Panther Party, Huey P. Newton, is imprisoned within solitary confinement. Writing from within his cell about the predominantly white movement against the U.S. war in Vietnam, he wrote, quote, "At one time, I thought that only blacks were colonized, but I think we have to change our rhetoric to an extent because the whole American people have been colonized if you view exploitation as a colonized effect, as an effect of colonization," he's saying. 76 companies have exploited everyone. American people are a colonized people, even more so than the people in developing countries where the military operates, end quote. Starting from a simultaneously class-focused and black-centered perspective, Newton was working to analyze the depth and extent of American empire and had come to the counterintuitive conclusion that it was not the people in distant countries who were most colonized, but rather the people at the center of the empire, economically, politically, and most of all, psychologically. In written correspondence that same year with the Detroit-based black nationalist organization, the Republic of New Africa, Huey Newton specified, quote, "Black people in this country suffer from the colonial plight more than any ethnic group in the country," end quote. But even as early as 1967, Newton wrote without qualification that the first waves of dispossessed, indentured European immigrant settlers of the American colonies were themselves also colonized. Quote, "Now these same colonized white people, these bondsmen, paupers, and thieves, deny the colonized black man not only the right to abolish this oppressive system, but to even speak of abolishing it," end quote. During the mid-1960s, the Black Panther Party was in broad agreement with black thinkers across the left about the status of black people in the United States, along with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on the one hand and the Revolutionary Action Movement on the other. The Black Panther Party affirmed that Afro-diasporic people throughout the Americas were colonized, a colonized population dispossessed and displaced by the transatlantic slave trade. So it was not an unpopular view at the time. In Newton's words, quote, "In America, black people are treated very much like the Vietnamese people or any other colonized people. The police in our community occupy our area as foreign troops occupy territory," end quote. The Black Panther Party additionally held the view that Afro-diasporic people are lumpenized, that is, produced as a precarious lumpen proletariat existing below the comfortably waged working-class proletariat, thrown into unemployment, underemployment, and semi-employment. So in contrast to, say, Foucault, the Black Panther Party embraced the term of lumpen proletariat, for what it's worth. Importantly, however, Newton additionally argued that those who have acquired regular and consistent access to the wage are no less colonized if we, as he suggested, view exploitation, the extraction of profitable surplus value from the workers' labor power, as something that can only really occur after colonization, as an effect of it. That is, only after human populations have been disconnected from their natural relationship to the land and the larger environment, forced by the pressures of starvation or immediate state violence, are they then coerced into labor so that profits can be made off of their work. In short, the landless are colonized and then turned into workers. Newton identifies the European colonizers as themselves prior colonized. After they had been colonized, immiserated, and shipped abroad, they then played the role of enforcing the colonization of others. Okay. By 1970, this perspective would come to be just a side detail in a broader theory conceptualized by Huey Newton called intercommunalism. According to the intercommunalist perspective, nation-states can no longer meaningfully be said to exist, he said in 1970, but have rather been reduced by the combined forces of global capital and imperialist conquest into local communities that lack control over their conditions of life and which can at most only become autonomous, liberated territories within that larger empire. According to this early analysis of what would later be called globalization, it is in fact in the heart of the empire, the US, say, where capitalist elites have the greatest control over the state, where military power is based and carceral institutions are most robust, where the people and territory are most colonized, where the exploitation of their labor is most developed, and where ideological control is most powerful, according to Newton. Okay. Colonized communities globally can, however, by seizing or creating local structures that allow for production, technology, and information, fight to build an interconnected and cooperative framework among themselves in a global dynamic that he called revolutionary intercommunalism. Essentially a network of communities that do not lay claim to nationhood, but fight to sustain their autonomy from global capitalist empire. To do this, the Black Panther Party created free health clinics, free food distribution, free schools in a practice of radical care. Lastly, Newton argued in 1970 that due to automation and the advance of technology, more and more of the population, black and white alike, would eventually be thrown into underemployment, unemployment, into lumpen proletarian status. So he says, you will then find an integration between the black unemployable and the white racist hard hat worker who is not regularly employed and mad at the blacks who he thinks threaten his job. We hope that he will join forces with those people who are already unemployable, but whether he does or not, his material existence will have changed. The proletarian will become the lumpen proletarian. End quote. Okay. A theory of the internal colonization of Europe can lead to a variety of interpretations, of course. One possible interpretation would be to suggest that if Europeans have indeed been colonized, then to decolonize would mean a revival of original European nationalisms. But this is not where Newton and the Black Panther Party took their thinking, of course. Instead, according to the theory of intercommunalism, nations no longer exist, and nationalism is obsolete as a potentially liberatory approach. Quote, We believe that there are no more colonies or neo-colonies. The people and the economy are so integrated into the imperialist empire that it's impossible to decolonize and to return to the former conditions of existence. If colonies cannot decolonize and return to the original existence as nations, the nations no longer exist, nor we believe will they ever exist again. While Newton believed that it was correct to call populations colonized, in 1970 he would reject the concept of decolonization as a backwards-looking approach to social change. In his view, these essentially conservative projects with the aim of revitalizing nationalism were bound to fail to engage adequately with the rapidly transforming world. To be clear, the Black Panthers defended the value of cultural history, but criticized it as ultimately inadequate for the broader needs of revolutionary culture, as they conceptualized it. Okay, now setting aside semantic questions, right, about the use of the word decolonization, this general view that nationalism is backwards looking was in large part compatible with the ideas articulated a decade earlier by one of the first theorists of colonization, Frantz Fanon. In the 1961 Le Damné de la Terre, Wretched of the Earth, orated by Frantz Fanon and written by his wife Josie Fanon, they critiqued the black nationalist movement of negritude for attempting to impose an idealized nationalism onto native populations that had already been uprooted from their traditions and were instead in the process of building newer, adaptive, revolutionary cultures that spoke to their mixed experiences between the rural and the urban, between the native and the colonial. For the Fanons, then, like with the Panthers after them, grasping the reality of colonization could not mean a return. However, of course, the fact of colonization nonetheless profoundly shapes the psychological experiences of colonized people. Now, if Newton was correct, we should also be able to identify among so-called white people, at the center of empire, not just extreme economic and political colonization, but also evidence of acute cultural and psychological colonization, as per the theories of Fanon. That is, we should be able to observe evidence of what scholars of Fanon have termed psychopolitics. According to the Fanon's description of the traumas of war, colonization is done onto territories, bodies, and psyches simultaneously. People's psychological hardwiring, so to speak, is reshaped by the trauma of violence, and in their earlier writings, orations, the Fanons explicitly defined colonization as the military organization of a people after they have been conquered. In other words, the continuation of war techniques after war, imposed on a population in the form of governance. Accordingly, for the colonized populations at hand for us here, Europeans and Americans that call themselves white, what relevance might we find in the Fanonian descriptions of the sorts of psychic affliction typical among the colonized, descriptions of muscular tension and of suicidal behavior? What do we make of Fanon's claim that, quote, the colonized native is the oppressed person whose permanent dream is to become the persecutor, end quote? In 1978, while completing his doctoral studies in the history of consciousness at the University of California, Santa Cruz, Huey Newton would pursue precisely this question of the social impact of the European internal colonization on the culture and psychology of Europeans. In an unpublished essay titled Eclipse of Community, The Making of the English Working Class, Newton reaffirms that exploitation requires a prior colonization. Quote, whether their destiny was chattel slavery or wage slavery, pre-industrial populations had to be conquered and colonized first, end quote. Quote, the English capitalist's first and most complete success at colonization was practiced upon his own countrymen, end quote. And drawing concepts from German sociologist Ferdinand Tönnies and British historian E.P. Thompson, Newton argues that a culture of contractual individualism and societal organization, I do not know how to pronounce German correctly, Gesellschaft, became predominant, subordinating the culture of the communalism that preceded it, Gemeinschaft. He ends the essay provocatively stating, quote, Only where the dissolution of communalism had not proceeded as far in Eastern Europe, Asia, and Africa did the resistance to capitalism grow to revolutionary proportions. Ironically, it was in the colonies, he puts colonies in quotation marks, meaning here the Third World, where the populations, and Eastern Europe, were not so thoroughly or successfully colonized as in England, end quote. Okay. So counting Newton, the two Fanons, and another theorist, a black theorist, who proposed that Europe underwent an internal colonization was Cedric Robinson, writer of the classic text Black Marxism, from which we derive today the concepts of the black radical tradition and racial capitalism. He quotes another historian to state simply, Europe colonized herself. And in his development of the influential concept of racial capitalism, Cedric Robinson argues that racialist thinking and racialist oppression was already a part of medieval European culture by the 10th century or so, before Europeans went out in 1492 and began to colonize other cultures. While Robinson is careful to use the word racialism in order to distinguish it from modern racism, once again, here we encounter a concept that can easily seem to converge with more conservative historical revisionisms and white nationalisms, frankly. For Robinson, though, his point is quite clear. To argue that Europeans only became racist once they encountered non-Europeans would be a tautology, would be circular, he argues. That's his language. It would be to concede that there was something already about non-European populations that naturally evoked the brutality that was done to them. The deeper historical record, though, as Robinson cites it, shows the opposite, evidenced in ancient Greek and Roman reverence for Egyptian and Nubian culture and knowledge. Instead, Robinson argues, Europeans had already conceived the difference between the peasants and the nobles as coming down to blood and breed, had already enslaved internal populations, had already had hierarchies of internal racialist difference that were used to justify war, rape, exploitation, cultural erasure, and domination. What Robinson calls, quote, the ideological phantasmagoria of race, end quote, is a construction of race and was used to rationalize the domination along class lines that were congruent with kinship formations in Europe, but which would then become recoded into naturalized racial terms. In brief, the poor were seen as inherently inferior as a lesser breed of people. This would carry over then, I guess I want to suggest, through the facts of criminalization with the development of the modern economy. Okay, now I want to suggest that these converging lines of European colonization produced by these theorists of the 60s, 70s, and 80s may be fruitful for thinking through many things, if I may. For one, a theory of the psychological impact of internal colonization and the reproduction of trauma can help us produce a less biologically racialist, biologically essentialist approach towards understanding why Western Europeans were so brutal in a seemingly historically unique way during their conquest and colonization of other peoples. So as people say, traumatized people, what's the phrase? Hurt people hurt people. People say that on the West Coast. I don't know. Okay. It might also help us understand better why and how particular structures of feelings, ways of treating others, ways of understanding oneself and others, like, say, ruthless individualism, and resultant ethical approaches seem to catch on and spread in a viral way from the colonizers to the colonized through the process of conquest itself, reproducing colonial mentalities that then tear away at the communalisms of native communities. In the Figure It Out text, I contributed an essay on the pain of hunger and suggested there that maybe we can think about why it's so hard for us to empathize with each other, why it's so hard to empathize with the suffering that we see all around us, perhaps due to a layered colonial history. But my focus in this talk is to suggest just a sketch of how such a theory might be helpful for thinking through the historical construction of the modern concept of the criminal as as an essential or inherent kind of person, the thing that makes it difficult for people to process their own figuring outs and kind of sit with them, I suppose, or to talk about them, to not feel terrible about themselves when they talk about these things. Anyways, the idea here being that with colonization, there always comes a typical villainization and a dehumanization of the colonized, produced in order to delegitimize their natural efforts to live, an ideology or set of perspectives that is racialist and distorts their efforts to sustain, care for, and protect themselves and each other, and to resist oppression. In retrospect, this tendency is easy to detect in how Europeans colonized non-European populations and criminalized them after 1492 for resisting, but I want to suggest that some of the same concepts, techniques, and forms of punishment to do so were already being developed during a prior period within Europe. Ultimately, what I want to suggest is that modern ideas of criminalization started with a European internal colonization, and then external colonization accelerated the development of those ideas. Racialisms compounded and eventually produced the hyper-dehumanizing treatment under modern capitalism that then Black thinkers have since then been analyzing and deconstructing for 5 centuries. Okay. So this section is very much a sketch. I'm like zooming through different historians to try to sketch out a narrative. Okay, across several essays and books in the 1980s, Charles Tilly, American sociologist, argues that the history of Europe between the 10th century and the 20th century was one of consistent internal wars. These wars began with a slow but eventually increasing collaboration between states and an early class of financiers, and was accomplished on the backs of countless peasant populations. Historian Susan Reynolds additionally has argued that alongside these early wars, the church had already begun to engage in enclosures of land and the displacement of peasants by the 12th century, long before the capitalist enclosures centuries later. Feminist scholar Silvia Federici also identifies enclosures of the commons already in this early medieval period, resulting in massive famine and unrest. According to her, the movements which resulted, starting in the marketplaces and led by women, were brutally put down through the creation of a moral panic that targeted women through the construction of the figures of the witch, the heretic and the witch. The concept of the witch was produced to blame the victims of a gendered internal colonial suppression, given what had been a more matrifocal society. As the state and church increasingly collaborated to put down the uprisings led by women, the concept of the witch was constructed to demonize social movement leaders who were hanged and burned at the stake. In a time of anxiety over population declines, as many women chose to ingest natural remedies to stop pregnancy, the witch was said to destroy and eat babies, destroy families, make men impotent, or arouse them by force, and copulate with the devil. The original criminal construct of false sexual dangerousness was women in the long history of European colonial criminalization and demonization. British historian E.P. Thompson agrees in his own writings that the market riots led by women was the place where reproduction, food, politics, and power intersected. And this period is in fact the era when those who live in the village are for the first time vilified, and we get the modern term villains that we use today. A villain is just a poor person who lives in a village, which becomes a negative word for the first time circa 1400. The word vulgar, which before simply meant a common person, also comes to carry for the first time its negative connotation in the medieval and early modern period. French philosopher Michel Foucault lectured about how, as enclosures multiplied and more Europeans were thrown off of their land, it became a crime to wander around without a master or without an estate that you were tied to. You were a vagabond, a vagrant, and the mere fact of movement was a problem, according to the political economists of the day. According to Foucault, those economists proposed forced enslavement of the vagabonds and branding them with hot irons. Like refugees and homeless people today in many places, being without an established place was treated as a crime in itself. As the modern prison developed, no longer did it target the old rebellious aristocrat, but now the common person was imprisoned en masse in this period. While E.P. Thompson believed the prisons were a response to the market riots, Foucault says that the bigger threat to the wallets and purses of the new rising business class was in fact the mass theft in the early proto-industrial workplaces, the ports, the docks, the mills, the warehouses. Historian Peter Limbaugh agrees, counting thousands upon thousands of hangings of thieves in Europe in this time. Immediately, riots followed the hangings, as common people saw their friends being executed for stealing goods at work in a way that prior traditions had normalized back when the workplace was in the fields, the orchards, and the rivers owned by the aristocrats. All poor people became criminalized, and the word gang shifts in meaning in the 1600s from a group of migrant workers to the now vicious connotation that it carries today. For the new class of merchants who invested all of their money in business infrastructure and inventory, any attack on private property felt like an attack on their very being, as British philosopher John Locke would explicitly argue in the 1600s. Locke was a philosopher, but also a major investor in colonial operations in Africa, the Caribbean, the Carolinas in North America, and enclosures inside of Britain. Involved in the Rye House plot to assassinate King Charles II of England, Locke fled to Holland to write his famous, but at the time anonymous, Two Treaties of Government. In that text, Locke presents the argument that a tyrant who threatens private property holdings is no better than a thief who threatens one's purse. He refers to them both as beasts and animals with whom no agreement can be made, whose mere existence throws all of society into a state of war, figures that can both be lawfully killed. According to Locke, any person who threatens the sanctity of property should be executed because an attack on property is an attack on the self. What is easily overlooked, however, is that the word criminal was relatively new when Locke used it to attack the old monarch's right of dominion in 1690. That's when it was published. He was writing before then. It had only been in use for a few decades for the first time as a noun to refer to a kind of person, to say that is a criminal. That was developed in like 1620s, 1630s, in English at least. With the new political economy being established in Europe and its Atlantic colonies, so came new ideas about the kinds of people that populate the world, of course, and how they should be treated. In Locke's mind, the lands held in common occupied by British peasants should be enclosed, just like the commons of the natives of the Americas, he said explicitly. The children of enslaved Africans should be treated just as their enslaved parents, as chattel, and a king who threatens property is no better than a common criminal. British historian Eric Hobsbawm has written of the historical consistency in oppressed communities of legends of bandits, Robin Hoods, and figures who were able to persist as ethical breakers of the state's law, specifically because of their acts of care for the communities who cared for them in turn. The situation was not dissimilar for the thousands upon thousands of pirates who roamed the Atlantic between 1690 and 1730, according to Marcus Rediker, Peter Limbaugh, and Rebecca Simon, historians all. What began as an extension of capitalism and human trafficking would eventually turn into counter-societies run upon egalitarian terms among these pirates, with elected leaders, equal pay, racial cooperation, funds for the disabled, and communally run ships where women and men could bend gender norms. By 1730, when piracy gets brutally suppressed, there were already dozens, if not hundreds, of communities of runaway African and indigenous slaves and European indentured servants in the mountains and swamps of the Americas. And these would be points of inspiration for the urban uprisings, dozens over the next decade, between 1730 and 1743, led by enslaved Africans in collaboration with colonized Irish and other migrant groups. When these plots failed, the organizers were treated just like the witches, the vagabonds, the thieves, the bandits, and the pirates, hanged and or burned at the stake, but now were increasingly racialized and targeted for being black. By the late 1700s, as we know, full-born revolutions of colonized people would overtake Europe, the Americas, and the Caribbean, reaching a crescendo in the Haitian Revolution of 1791. Over the next several decades, slaves went on strike, in the words of W.E.B. Du Bois, and people who had been reduced to property stole away and looted themselves, as Saidiya Hartman and Vicky Osterweil have put it, forcing their own emancipation from slavery. In the aftermath of the Civil War in the United States, millions of black, landless, colonized people became equated with criminality merely for existing, with black male community leaders a special target of moral panic and false sexualized villainization, as early black feminists Ida B. Wells and Angela Davis have argued. All that said, most criminalization, of course, has nothing to do with revolution and revolt, but rather with everyday people's everyday efforts to live with dignity and some semblance of joy, surrounded by people who love them. In the 20th century, being poor and criminalized made you a target for eugenics and sterilization in many parts of the world, and poor women were increasingly villainized for receiving welfare and financial support, especially if they were black, brown, and migrant, so that eventually even their children would be called super predators. In the United States, where 1/3 of the population has been arrested and thus has a criminal record, one is forced to ask whether we are a nation of criminals or whether, rather, we are just colonized and living at the center of an empire. Today, as these old ideological concepts of the criminal intersect and layer upon each other, the criminalization of blackness has been a globalized ideology for several decades now. The figure of the migrant is still punished just for moving. The terrorist label is placed upon peaceful community organizers, and moral panic targets gender nonconforming human beings who have always existed. Okay, so on the one hand, as human beings have been around for about 200,000 years, but states, on the other, have only been around for 5, maybe 10,000 years. So in my view, notions of social law are inherent to human societies, but as states developed in history, the states colonized law and claimed monopoly over its origin, as if law comes from states rather than from human beings and human societies. Call it democracy, or call it whatever you like. It seems to me that as communities act, they assert forms of counter law through their actions. I'm finishing. That's what that means. Including critical values, humane values in messy ways. People naturally assert their feelings about how they feel that things should be, or how things supposedly have always been, and sometimes people are confident but simply mistaken that the state's laws are more just than they are. In any case, the frame, even as people are doing all this figuring out, I think people consistently nonetheless affirm law at a level of representation to themselves. People expect the law to be right because naturally, I want to suggest, we are a law-affirming species or something, or creatures, even as people nonetheless take up the various actions needed to survive. It seems to me that what states consider a crime, then, is different from what we as human communities generally consider a crime, acknowledging again that human communities have been around for a lot longer. It is from this standpoint, then we can affirm, I think, without too much qualification, that a person stealing bread should not be a crime, but a person going hungry definitely is, in a world in which there is more than enough food to go around. Thank you for your time.